All right, it's 4 o'clock. I think we're good to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Katie Monahan, and I'm a communications strategist here at the Ohio Arts Council, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Budgeting During a Global Pandemic. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, there are just a few housekeeping items to go over. First, we're broadcasting in Zoom and on Facebook Live this afternoon, so we can share this valuable information with as many people as possible. So to help cut down on feedback issues during the presentation, we have everyone set to listen only mode, but that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. If you're joining us in Zoom, please use the Q&A box in your control panel to type your questions. And for our friends on Facebook, go ahead and type your questions in the comment section of the live stream post. We'll monitor the questions as they come in throughout the webinar, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. Next, if you experience audio issues or have trouble connecting, we recommend refreshing your browser, and if that doesn't work, try logging off and logging back in. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll post the recording on the OAC's webinar page and on our YouTube channel within 48 hours of this broadcast. So if you can't listen to the entire thing live, or you want to go back and re-listen or share it with a colleague or a friend, you can find it in either of those locations. That does it for housekeeping. Next, I'd like to bring on Kathy Signorino, the OAC's Artist Programs and Percent for Art Director, to talk about some exciting upcoming professional development opportunities for our artists. So, hey, Kathy, can you tell us a little bit about what the Artist Programs, the Folk and Traditional, and the Rife Gallery team have in store for our audience later this spring and summer?
Sure, Katie, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Beginning next Wednesday, we will be hosting 3 webinars for individual artists. The first on Wednesday, May 29th at 4 p.m. Katie Davis, the new IA program coordinator, and I will be walking through how to make an application to the Individual Excellence Award Grant Program. Then on Wednesday, June 17th, I will be joined by OAC Folk and Traditional Arts contractor, Christina Benedetti, to share information about resources and programs available to Ohio's folk and traditional artists. The final of the 3-part series is presented on Wednesday, July 8th, when Katie Davis will join Rife Gallery Director Kat Sheridan to talk about best practices for visual artists looking to break into the professional art realm. The Friday after each of these webinars, we will hold 15-minute one-on-one Q&A sessions. You will be able to reserve your spot the day of each webinar. Don't miss out on these exciting professional development opportunities, and I will turn it back to you, Katie.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Kathy. I have to say, Kathy, Katie, Christina, and Kat all have a lot of experience and wisdom to share. So yeah, definitely mark your calendars. You do not want to miss those webinars. All right, well, now it's time to get going on the main presentation. We know that financial planning is hard right now, and in truth, it's never easy. But now more than ever, budget management is critical to navigating our changing world, and it is okay to ask for help. And we are fortunate to have fiscal expert Elaine Grogan Luttrull here of Minerva Financial Arts to help us walk us through some scenarios to plan for during the ongoing pandemic and for the eventual recovery. So welcome, Elaine. We're so glad to have you here. I will turn things over to you now.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Katie, and huge thanks to the Ohio Arts Council for having these important conversations. I know this webinar series in particular looks pretty fantastic. As Katie mentioned, I'm Elaine, and I am one of the luckiest CPAs ever because I have the privilege of working with creative individuals and organizations all over the country to help with the business side of creativity. It's not always necessarily the most fun part of being an individual artist or an arts organization, but it's crucial to building something sustainable long term. So what I thought we would do today is go over certainly information about budgeting, but I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge a couple of ground rules. We wanted to make sure there is plenty of space for questions and communications. So make sure you're sharing the floor with respect and definitely put all of those questions that you might have either in the Q&A feature within Zoom or in the comment section on Facebook, and we will address as many questions as we can. everyone here is equal parts teacher and learner, and that means you are all experts in your own experiences. So it is very possible that some of what I will say will resonate perfectly for you or your organization, or it's possible that something might not be a good fit for you. That's okay. You are the expert in your own experience, so take the information you need and carry what really works with you. Lastly, we want to make sure that stories stay kind of within this space, but the lessons leave. So that means if someone shares something a little bit more personal or a little bit more challenging in a question or something, we definitely want to make sure those sorts of situations stay within this webinar, but definitely take the lesson that comes from the answer to that question or that description and then carry that with you as well. So as we go through all of this, specifically what we're going to do is talk about budgeting. But more specifically, I thought it would be helpful to walk through scenario planning, which is what a lot of individuals and organizations are doing right now to think about budgeting under very uncertain circumstances. We'll talk about the impact of some of these different scenarios on revenues, whether you are an organization that relies on contributions or funding from foundations or governmental entities, or if you're an individual that relies on grants or selling your work or providing services for income. We'll talk about some different impacts on revenues that we're seeing across the industry, and you can hopefully use some of that information as you're modeling out what your numbers might look like for the next year or so. And then we'll go through some strategies to solve shortfalls because many of us are expecting for budgets to look a little ugly and hairy over the next year or so. So we'll talk about some effective strategies we're seeing for both organizations and individuals to cope with some of the uncertainty right now. And of course, although I am a CPA, all of this information is educational in nature and not intended to be tax, legal, or accounting advice. So if you've done a budgeting webinar with me before, you probably remember the 5 steps that I like to talk about when it comes to budgeting, and the idea that a budget is a tool for empowerment, and it is imperfect, but something that you can revisit iteratively. And it really is rooted in this idea of mapping out where you want to go and matching your goals or your organization's goals with the numbers to get you there. But that's normal budgeting. We are not in a time right now where budgeting is normal at all. We are in the middle of unprecedented times and a time of great uncertainty. So that means the normal budgeting rules don't necessarily apply. So what I've been talking about with a lot of organizations is this idea of scenario planning. And this is an approach that might feel familiar to many of you, but basically what it looks like is you take stock of where you are right now, and then you map out 4 or so different options of where we might be in the future. And then we use that to think about potential new ideas for connecting with our audiences, for maintaining connections with our communities, and for generating additional revenue. The reason we like to look at a variety of scenarios is because much of what will unfold over the next couple months is not necessarily under our control. So if we've planned for a couple of different options, it's easier to respond nimbly when we better understand what we are able to do as the virus progresses or maybe resurges or goes away entirely. So this idea of scenario planning allows you to have a very flexible budget that you can take in a couple of different directions based on how the facts and circumstances evolve. And when it comes to those new ideas, what we're seeing a lot is organizations and individuals coming up with a whole lot of different ideas, which is fantastic. But that doesn't mean that every idea is going to make sense for you to pursue. So we're at the stage right now where a lot of people are still coming up with a lot of ideas, some great, some not so great. But I thought it made sense to sort of dive into some of the criteria maybe we might use to evaluate some of those ideas as you are watching these scenarios unfold. So that's generally the budgeting approach we'll walk through together today. So the first step in following this scenario planning budgeting approach is to define your own guiding principles. And we're seeing this especially at the organizational level, but it does make sense at the individual level as well. And basically what this means is articulating some key tenets that you'll be following as you're making these decisions. And some of these may seem very obvious, but I think it's helpful to have them in writing in front of anyone who's making some challenging financial decisions. Because if the decisions can be rooted in these guiding principles, it might be easier to identify what really is the best decision for you or for your organization. There are some examples of these guiding principles here on the screen. Prioritizing the health and safety of your people tends to be up at the top of some of these guiding principle lists. And people can include your staff, your performers, your stakeholders, your audience members, your funders, your customers. It can really be any people that are affected by your work. So thinking about the impact of your decisions on their health and safety is an important thing to consider as you're making these choices. Thinking about maximizing the impact of your programs, specifically in fulfillment of your mission, is also a good thing to keep in mind. And it's important to be transparent to the extent possible about the difficult decisions you'll be making. I think everyone is fully aware that difficult decisions are being made and will probably need to be made going forward. So to the extent that you can be transparent about the criteria for making those decisions and why that may have been the best decision to make, I think that helps with the communication of challenging choices. It's also interesting to think about both the short-term and long-term implications of the choices you'll be making. Something might make perfect sense in the short term, but maybe not necessarily long-term. And one of the challenges of existing and making art right now is balancing those two competing time horizons. There is a need to serve people immediately in their time of need, and also a need to understand that the organization and the art and the individual will continue beyond this moment in time. So thinking about the financial implications of your short-term and long-term decisions is something to keep in mind. You can certainly have a guiding principle that addresses the ethics of your purchasing choices, whether that is prioritizing businesses in your community or prioritizing supporting those whose values align with your own. That is certainly something to think about. And then thinking about having some sort of guiding principle that addresses evaluating key metrics and being able to adjust plans going forward is a good thing to keep in mind. Again, for organizations, developing these guiding principles and sharing them with your board or a finance committee or your senior leadership staff to keep everyone on the same page is a really great strategy. And for individuals, you can certainly have many of these same guiding principles as you are thinking about running your own creative practice and continuing to make your own work, right? You'll see these are very similar to what we saw on the organization front. And for you, maybe these are guiding principles that you jot down for yourself, or maybe you share them with your mentors or your key advisors or the other key decision makers that you draw upon for help within your practice. After you've got your defining principles, the next thing to do is to start defining these different scenarios. And again, I've been seeing usually 4 different scenarios, but organizations can certainly come up with 3 scenarios, maybe even 2. But these scenarios are going to be unique to your own organization or your own creative practice. So let your own normal calendar of events kind of dictate what these scenarios look like. But in general, these scenarios might range from very optimistic to fairly pessimistic. The most optimistic version could be a version of what your budget might normally look like if we were not in the midst of a global pandemic. That would certainly be very, very optimistic. You could also think about programming returning to normal by late summer or early fall. Maybe there's a little bit of a reduced revenue from some of the programs you'll be doing, but then things getting normal-ish by early 2021. I would put that in a very optimistic category of a scenario. Another scenario might assume there will be no revenue coming in at all for the summer. And then the fall programming, if that's a normal part of your operations, might happen, but it might happen at greatly reduced revenue. Maybe you're considering virtual options, or maybe you're considering options where capacity for ticket sales or attendance is limited pretty dramatically. That would result in fairly reduced revenue numbers for the fall. And then maybe we start to see those pick back up in the spring. And then by next summer, things get back to normal. If we were to think about a slightly less optimistic scenario than that, we might assume those reduced revenue numbers continue through the spring of 2021, and then things start to slightly come back to normal by fall. And then we're looking at 2022, where things might be back to normal-ish. And then our probably most pessimistic scenario might be the scenario 4, which may assume there will be no revenue, maybe aside from some emergency funding grants or other contributions of emergency support through summer of 2021. And then we see things starting to pick back up slowly at the end of 2021 and into 2022. Again, these scenarios are going to be driven by what your operations look like. If you are an organization that normally performs twice a year, once in the fall and once in the spring, your scenarios might look different from an individual artist who has the capacity to continue teaching studio workshop classes, albeit in an online capacity, starting the fall. So I'd encourage you to start with your programs and look at what programmatically you think might happen over the next year, maybe 18 months or so, and then use various scenarios driven by those programs to kind of outline what your most optimistic and least optimistic scenarios might look like. I'll pause here. Katie, are there any questions that have come in possibly about the scenarios or some of those guiding principles?
Nothing yet. It looks like you've been very thorough, so thank you.
I will just keep going then. After you've got the scenarios, the next step is then to add the numbers in. And this is when it's going to start to feel like a regular budgeting exercise. I favor this type of approach to building out the scenarios and the budgets, where you're basically starting with the categories you might normally have under income and expenses, and then you've got different columns for each different scenario. For an organization, you might want to think about distinguishing your expenses by function, if that makes sense for you, but that might not make sense for you. It might be easier to look at them in this category, and that is perfectly fine. For an individual, your budget will probably look pretty similar. You want to list all of your potential income sources, and then when it comes to listing your expenses, the challenge for an individual is deciding if this budget is going to be just for your creative business, or if it's going to be for your creative business and your personal life. And we know in creative world, sometimes those things are very, very intertwined. So the idea of figuring out what you're budgeting for really might make more sense to look at for both your personal life and your business. But that's entirely up to you. You get to define the scenarios and decide what layout for your budget makes the most sense. As we're going through this process of adding the numbers, assuming the level of revenues or projecting the level of income that might be reasonable is going to be probably the biggest challenge. And that's going to inform a whole lot of the expense choices. And so deciding what your revenue assumptions are going to be is going to be very key. And again, this depends on what your creative practice looks like. If you are an individual and a lot of your income comes from selling at fairs or festivals, maybe you're looking at a calendar where fairs and festivals have been canceled for the next 3 to 4 months. And then after that, even if they happen, maybe the revenue you will be expecting is maybe 40 to 50% of what you would normally earn from that particular fair or festival. Going line by line in each revenue or income category for your own practice is going to be the process here, where you're thinking about realistically, knowing that your numbers won't be perfect, but realistically, what might be a reasonable assumption to start planning for some revenue under those different scenarios. If you're an individual and you're selling mostly online, and maybe you've been selling mostly online for quite some time, maybe for you, one scenario is you continue to earn 100% of the revenues that you would normally earn because your online business was up and running and pretty functional even before this happened. Maybe another scenario for you is that you will continue to sell online, but maybe it'll be 60 to 70% of what you would normally earn. And maybe you're making that assumption because you know the people you generally sell to, your typical customers or clients, are those that are heavily affected by what's going on economically right now. I think thinking about and understanding the purchasing choices that your customers or clients are going to be making is an important thing to inform some of these revenue projections you might be wrestling with. If you sell through a gallery, or maybe you sell primarily to corporate partners, maybe you'll see that your revenue may or may not necessarily be as affected. If your gallery sends or serves a high-end clientele, for example, they might not be particularly affected by what's going on economically, and it might be a really good time for them to purchase some more art. So maybe you will not see nearly as great of an impact on your revenue. Alternatively, maybe one of your best corporate partners is a local hotel. We know that the hotel and travel and leisure industry has really been hit hard by the pandemic. So maybe if most of your revenue is coming from that particular type of client, maybe you know that you're going to be looking at a scenario where maybe 20% of normal revenue is what you can plan for or expect. Again, this comes back to what does your budget look like, and going line by line to make some assumptions about what kind of revenue you think might be reasonable under these different scenarios. The same is true if you're someone who teaches in schools, whether that is teaching at colleges or universities, either as an adjunct or a full-time instructor, or maybe teaching in elementary schools or community centers. Thinking about what those institutions are doing and the budget challenges they're facing can help inform your own projections about what it might be reasonable to expect an income from those partners. We are definitely seeing funding from city and state sources be hit by this. I think probably many of you are paying attention to cities around Columbus who may fund the arts through collection of a bed tax. It's very, very probable that those collections will be much lower for this particular period. So you can imagine the city funding, if it's funded by that, will probably be lower than we would expect over the next couple of years. And the same is true if you're paying attention to funding at the state level, right? Our states generate revenue through sales tax, and sales are down lately. So that means sales tax revenues are down. So if much of your income comes from city or state funding, you might want to think about planning for a reduction in that income going forward. If you are someone who has a part-time job with a not-for-profit, again, many not-for-profit organizations are struggling right now. So thinking about whether or not your hours will be reduced, or whether or not your job will continue to exist, or maybe you've already been laid off either temporarily or permanently. All of these things are going to inform the revenue projections you're going to be making under your scenarios. For performance organizations, you're going to be going through the same sort of logic or explanations, right? And not just performance organizations, but all types of organizations. You're going to go through this same exercise. The exercise of saying, okay, if we're going to have a show this fall and we are going to maintain social distancing among our audience members, in our theater, does that mean we can sell 30% of tickets? Or maybe we can sell 50% of tickets we would normally sell. So thinking about the impact of those reduced ticket sales on your revenue is a big part of this process. If you are a presenting organization, you are probably paying close attention to the number of tours that have announced they will not be performing or touring for the next year or so. And that's going to have a big impact on your own revenue, especially if you are the presenting organization that relies on ticket sales from major tours coming through to support some of your other operations. If you're an organization that relies on educational offerings, maybe your partnerships with schools are such that you can continue to maintain offerings virtually, or maybe your schools are telling you that they're not going to have the budget to do even a virtual field trip to some sort of organization this fall or next spring. So thinking about what some of those conversations sound like and how you're going to adjust your revenue projections accordingly is really important. Similarly, if you're the organization that relies on revenue from summer camps, we're seeing lots of organizations do creative adjustments to a virtual summer camp or what that might look like. And some families are responding to that really well. Others are saying they're not really interested in that. So thinking about the impact of virtual summer camps or even canceled summer camps on your revenue is important. And there's also a nice counterpoint to that as well. There was a theater company in Texas that I was working with who shared that they were planning to cancel a summer camp that they normally do for teenagers because they figured teenagers wouldn't really be interested in more virtual summer camps. And the students they reached out to were actually even more interested in participating in a virtual summer camp and thought it would be really cool and very amazing. And so this organization has actually increased their revenue from summer camp tuition by moving virtually. And they did not expect that at all. And they're still a little surprised that that is what is unfolding and at the level of enthusiasm from these particular campgoers. But I think it's an example of how thinking about all of your revenues line by line, and then engaging with those you serve to make sure you're understanding kind of what they're thinking is going to help you make projections that are getting as close to reality as you can possibly get right now. Organizations that rely on major holiday shows in December are paying very close attention and thinking about what sort of revenue impact a canceled show or a virtual show or some sort of adapted show with a smaller audience will have on their fundraising for the year. And it's important to be thinking about those things now. Similarly, if you're an organization that relies on tourist traffic and you know in your particular city that tourism is down 40 or 50%, that's going to have a huge impact on the revenues you derive from those visitors to your city. The same is true about reliance on state funding or on the relationships you have with certain corporations. We know it is a very, very tough time economically for our governmental leaders and also for our business leaders. And so thinking about what the impact financially will be on your organization coming through those sources is important. And lastly, even if you're an organization with a very strong endowment, you might be counting on distributions from that endowment to continue to sustain you, which is fantastic. But you're also probably doing some modeling around what happens if the invested assets within the endowment decrease again. Earlier this year, we saw about a 30% reduction in the market generally. So that much of that has been corrected. But if you're still looking at this and watching this, right, if your endowment is invested and you see a 30% drop in the market, that definitely impacts the distributions available to serve your organization. So there are a lot of moving parts here, and doing the math around the numbers for planning under these scenarios is definitely not easy, but it's important to slow down, take your time, and really think through scenario by scenario what might be reasonable for each of these funding sources. As I mentioned, this is not going to be a quick exercise. If you were hoping I would tell you, just cut revenue by 30% and then see what happens, right? That's a perfectly fine approach to take, but that is not going to serve you well in the long run. If you really want to use these scenarios effectively, it makes sense to take the time now to really dig into the numbers and plan out a couple of different options so that you can make informed choices for your staff and your stakeholders and your donors and your community and everyone else who is served by your creativity. We know in Ohio, current year spending has been cut by about $775 million. We also know, it was reported in Columbus CEO, that the city of Columbus is planning that there won't be any major kind of gatherings or conventions or major tourist events until spring of 2021. And we know as of last week, 36.5 million people have filed for unemployment. So those are a couple of just bigger picture numbers to help you place in context some of these assumptions you're going to be making. Because as you start drilling into understanding who you serve and whether or not they are individuals who have been heavily affected economically or not, that has an impact on your revenue. One of the key questions that has come up in some of the conversations I've been having relates to the time frame. So what time frame are you supposed to be looking at? That's a really great question. I like the idea of focusing very clearly on the next 3 months or so. I think there's probably some additional clarity we have around what the next 3 months will look like. It's not perfect clarity, but I think you can formulate a fairly solid plan for the next 3 months or so. That's also a really good time frame to be looking at if you're managing cash very carefully. But then I wouldn't stop there, even though there is considerably more uncertainty happening after that 3-month period. I would encourage you to look to your end of the end of your fiscal year. If that for you is June 30th, I would push yourself a little bit more, but maybe the end of your fiscal year is, sometime in the fall, or maybe your fiscal year ends on December 31st as well. I would definitely do some pretty robust planning to get you to the end of your fiscal year. If you're an organization whose fiscal year ends on June 30th, you're probably already building a budget for the next fiscal year. So then I would continue those projections out for a year and then maybe add on 6 months or so. So thinking about carrying some of these projections in pencil, not in pen, but carrying them out to December of 2021 is probably not a terrible strategy. You can always adjust them as things become more clear, but I think it's also helpful to think about immediately, how are you managing cash in the short term? How are you getting through the end of your fiscal year? And then how are you getting through maybe 12 months or so beyond that? Another question that's been coming up is about approaching corporate partners or new funders right now. And I think this is an interesting question and conversation to be having because the arts are such a unifier. I would hate for us to stop having conversations with other potential partners because times are tough. It seems like a really effective time to be continuing conversations that have already started and maybe focusing on the real value that you or your organization is providing right now. So I would encourage you to focus on what has changed about what you do and also what has not changed about what you do. So perhaps you're an organization that had a corporate sponsor for an event you were having this summer, and maybe the event isn't happening, but maybe the purpose of the event or the mission of your organization's involvement in the event is still happening. Maybe you are still connecting community or fostering some sort of virtual experience that meets the objectives and the goals of the event. I think having a conversation with the sponsor that reinforces all the things that have not changed, even while the delivery of the event may have changed a little bit, is important because it's always going to be important to emphasize the value that your organization or your work is delivering. And that value and the importance of that hasn't changed. There are some businesses and industries that are less affected than others. So I think if you are an organization who is targeting potential new corporate partnerships right now, that's not a terrible thing to be doing if you're targeting corporations or businesses in industries that are doing okay. We see the distribution industry doing okay right now. We see some companies within media and entertainment doing okay right now. We see advertising doing okay right now. They're not thriving, but they're doing okay. And so I think if you're looking for potential collaborative partnership opportunities with business entities, thinking about entities that are okay right now might be a good strategy. And then thinking about sort of holistic partnerships. So let's pretend you're an organization and you're seeking sponsorship for a virtual event you want to do, and you want your grocery store to be a potential sponsor. Is there a way to think about some sort of partnership that involves the grocery store giving you money to sponsor the event in exchange for, a logo placement or acknowledgement or something like that? But can it also involve you providing some sort of private artistic experience to their staff in some way? So you can think about ways of broadening the exchange from simply being money in exchange for advertisement to include providing creative value or artistic value to a company whose workers are probably pretty tired and overworked right now. So thinking about what some sort of holistic partnership or sponsorship agreement looks like is going to be an interesting way to have conversations with some of those companies right now. Okay, that's sort of the revenue conversation and sort of some big picture numbers about how challenging things might be. Katie, I'll pause here for a second just to check in and see if there are questions that you'd like me to address.
Thanks, Elaine. I think we are good. I just wanted to say, I think all that was really helpful. A lot of those questions were questions that I know people have had, so I can tell you, you've been doing this for a while. I think it's helpful. You know, there's so much unknown, and you've given us a nice, sometimes there's so much unknown, you don't know where to start, and you feel overwhelmed. And so you've given us a really nice foundation of, okay, here's where you can start. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome, Katie. Okay, so once we've done all that, and remember, we've listed sort of the guiding principles to ground the decisions we've made. We've set up those different scenarios, and then we've started adding the numbers, right? The fourth step is then to start exploring some of those new revenue options. And this is where I sort of start getting really excited, right? Because looking at what the numbers look like can be pretty daunting, but there is still tremendous value in the arts. So thinking about going back to your mission statement, or if you are an individual, the unique value you provide, whether that is a single statement that you have crafted very carefully, or it's a sort of fuzzier idea of the value you provide, go back to that, right? And get really clear on what is the value you provide. And then think about, who do you serve and what do they need right now? Because those you serve may have had needs that have changed a little bit, right? Then use that and that kind of brainstorming to generate some new ideas about what you can do to provide that value to those you serve right now. And then we evaluate the ideas to figure out which ones might make sense. I put together this quick evaluation criteria table, but you can choose whatever criteria makes sense for you. In thinking about new potential options to serve those you serve, I think it makes sense to decide whether or not it aligns with your value, that really core thing you do. For an organization, maybe that's your mission statement, right? Maybe that is a slightly different statement of the real value you provide. But does this new idea align with the value you provide, right? And you can think about, you know, yes, no, or maybe sort of being a scale to evaluate that on. Then is it something those you serve value right now? They might value it under normal circumstances, but is it something they would value right now? And then you think about what it might cost, what you might earn from it, either through earned income or through contributions, if it's going to be a donation-based event. And then thinking about how it might help you strategically. So if those are the criteria statements we're going to use, it makes sense to kind of dig into each one a little bit. Does it align with your value? Is it something that you're already really good at doing? Does it align with your strengths? Or does it require you to create a new strength? And do you have the capacity to do that right now? You know what you do and who you serve. Does this still help those individuals? Is it still something they need? And then how are you going to do it? Your strengths probably haven't changed. What you do and who you serve probably hasn't changed all that much either, but how you do what you do may have changed pretty dramatically. And then in thinking about who you serve, it's interesting to think about what they need right now. We always come back to this idea of community or connection and the arts as a unifier, and I think that's really, really important. But I'd encourage you not to guess that that's what those you serve need right now. Do some digging, have some conversations with your key stakeholders or your best customers or your members that renew every year. Think about what they really do need and value right now. There was a group I was working with I think they were in Southern Vermont, who shared that every summer they regularly have a large event with a silent auction, and they were disappointed because they were losing out on some revenue that event generally generated. But in starting to have conversations with some of their most loyal donors, all of the donors were ecstatic that they weren't having another luncheon to attend virtually or something like that, right? Now, having said that, lots of groups are going in the opposite direction and doing these very meaningful events virtually. It's important that you understand what those you serve are valuing right now, and then making decisions that are informed by that. I'm not saying let your audience dictate your programming, but I am saying don't guess about what you think your people need. Have some conversations and remember that human connection to confirm things. Some of the interesting partnerships ideas I've seen, and these might not be new ideas to any of you, you may have already been doing some of these, but thinking about if there is some kind of virtual experience that can involve a partnership with a local restaurant, for example. We've seen examples of organizations partnering with local wineries or sort of wine tasting kind of venues, and the group will deliver, say, a bottle of wine and some cheese and crackers along with a card from the organization or something like that. And then anyone who has paid to attend an event will open up this, boxed meal type of thing and share it via Zoom while the organization is providing programming, right? That's an interesting idea, and it can be a way to also support some of your partners in the community that could really use some business right now. Other organizations have done virtual wine tastings that have been hosted by other groups, I had a session with an organization earlier this week that partnered with a local restaurant to do one night where a portion of all the takeout meals, I think it was 10%, maybe 15% of all the takeout meals was donated to the organization. And so, there were interesting additional things the organization was providing that the restaurant could then give to its patrons. So thinking about what are some interesting partnership ideas that could happen right now that might benefit both partners is a really interesting strategy. I mentioned the example earlier about partnering with a grocery store or a distribution company and including some sort of creative component that they can provide to their employees. There was a dance company that did something similar by providing a movement and stretching class to stalkers at a distribution company in California, right? It's a nice moment where a sponsorship can go in multiple directions and it reinforces the value that the organization provides. As you're thinking about all of these new ideas, and remember, you're coming up with a lot of them, and probably a lot of people are sharing their ideas with you as well. Go through this process. Think about if it aligns with your value, if those you serve really want it right now, and then write down what it will cost and what you think you might earn from it. Whether it is going to be some sort of ticketed event or whether it is going to generate contributions. Either way is fine. We've seen some organizations move their programming to a ticketed event online, which is great. We've seen other organizations and individuals move to donation-based events online. That is also great. We've also seen some sort of creative hybrid models. One organization was asking their major donors to underwrite a performance, and then they were offering it for free to anyone who wanted to attend, knowing that it was underwritten by a major donor who was acknowledged and thanked, and then it included a request for contributions as part of the performance. I think it's important that you kind of practice what that language sounds like or looks like, instead of just, saying something off the cuff or hoping people will just donate, because sometimes people need a reminder or a little nudge or something like that. So maybe your event includes something that is being offered for free to everyone, and maybe you say something at the beginning or the end along the lines of, normally an event like this would cost $75 per ticket. We are really happy to be providing it for free to provide some value to those of you who are stuck at home right now. We'd really appreciate any contribution you might make to our organization or something like that. You get to decide what feels authentic to you, but figuring out who's going to communicate that message and what it sounds like as part of the event, especially if you are relying on contributions to that event, is going to be really important. The last piece about thinking about these new ideas is thinking about how these ideas are going to help you strategically, right? And what I mean by that is at some point, things are going to go back to some new version of normal. And I think it's really helpful to think about how is what you are doing now building toward the next step that you want to take as an individual or as an organization. And so one example I saw, this was from a different dance company, and this organization decided that they did not want to do any sort of virtual programming. For them, that was just not a fit, and that is not something they wanted to pursue. But they did want to provide some sort of connection to their creativity. So they came up with this idea of a digital care package. And the way it works is an individual would purchase a $25 care package, answer some questions about the recipient, and then one of the dancers from the company would record a personalized message and a small creative movement piece, and then that would be delivered digitally to the recipient, right? So it was a nice way to connect with their audience members and their core supporters, and it was feeling like it was really capturing the value of what they did very well. It also helped that this was generating some revenue to support the organization and also to pay some of the company members as well. So felt like it was a great idea, on and on. But if you think about taking that one step further to think about how it can then lead to the next thing, that's what I mean by using it strategically. So what if you add an ask at the end of the digital care package to see if they would like to send a similar digital care package to someone else? Now, obviously, you do some diligence ahead of time to make sure that that person is willing and able to think about that, right? But that's certainly something you could think about. You could also think about, since you've got these digital care packages recorded, is there a way you can use some of that recorded collateral in some sort of campaign, or to offer this to a larger audience, or to satisfy the requirement of a funder to reach a certain number of audience members or something? Or could you even share this idea with key business partners, right? The idea that a digital care package could be delivered from a boss to a team of remote workers could be kind of interesting. So thinking about how you can take one of these new ideas that feels like it makes sense for your organization and then use it to lead to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing after that can make sure that you're not pursuing these things in vain or just kind of scrambling to put something together, but you really are approaching your creative output in a way that's going to serve you and your organization long term. And then the last piece of this process of scenario planning is to make some hard choices. As you're looking at your budgets, whether you are an individual or whether you are an organization, your people are probably your most expensive line item, right? So many organizations are looking at and modeling different options to retain as many staff members as possible, but maybe think about reducing salaries a smidge, or even considering layoffs. If you are an individual artist and you have others you work with, either as contractors or as employees, you're probably doing some of this same math. You may have seen this story. There's a company called Gravity that was facing some of the same financial pressures that many organizations and individuals are facing. And their CEO was remarkably transparent. And one of the ideas that emerged in talking with the team is that individuals could privately communicate what, if any, pay cut they were willing and able to take. And that worked out really well for this particular company. Maybe that works for your organization, maybe it doesn't at all. But personnel is probably an area where you're thinking about making some big, hard choices. Facilities are probably your other biggest line item. It's probable that you're exploring ways of letting go some office space, or maybe reducing your footprint a little bit, especially if teams are very comfortable working remotely, and that might not have to be an ongoing expense you have. But that's an important thing to consider. And that's again why these scenarios can be so helpful, because you can play out what does it look like if we reduce our office space by 40% and have people come in periodically. Will we meet sort of reduced capacity and social distance requirements, and will that be an option? And of course, we know that programmatic costs are definitely the hardest to eliminate. Another question that I have heard is, you know, what if you're going through this process and you're thinking about your new ideas and they make sense and you're thinking strategically and you feel like you can make things work long term, but what are you going to do about cash flow right now? And for what it's worth, I think that's a really fantastic place to be in. If you can see clearly a path to recovery for your organization or for yourself, that's pretty fantastic. But cash flow can still be a challenge. So maybe you think about cutting your expenses sooner than you would otherwise have to sort of conserve cash. Maybe you think about applying for some of those emergency grants, or maybe even some of those emergency loans. Loans we like less than we like grants, of course, because you do have to pay them back. But from a cash flow perspective, that might be an okay choice for you or your organization to make right now. I think it's also interesting to think about all the work you have done historically to build relationships with those who love you and who love your work. It's an okay time to reach out and tap them for some support right now. They might not be willing or able to provide support, but some of them might be. So thinking about, is it a great time to reach out to your most loyal collectors and see if they'd be willing to purchase a piece, or maybe prepay for a commission they were thinking about doing, or maybe asking your annual donors if they would consider a second gift, especially right now when cash might be a little bit tight. I think those are all things you can kind of think about. We're also seeing lots of funders releasing their restrictions. So this is especially effective for organizations. If you have some cash flow and the restrictions have been released, all of a sudden that gives you a lot more freedom to spend some of that money on keeping your doors open right now. And then as you're thinking about some of these conversations you might be having, it's interesting to also think about whether or not a sponsorship opportunity or some sort of commitment from a partner can extend for multiple years. That's not a terrible conversation to be having right now, so that you can get some cash right now and then know that the cash will continue. At the opposite end of the spectrum, I'm also hearing from some organizations that, you know, this is not going to work for them. Should we shut down? That is a very hard conversation to be having right now, but it is a conversation that many boards and organizations and even individuals are having, because it's tough. It's really, really tough. I would say, though, that before you decide just to shut down, it's interesting to think about maybe reimagining what the organization could look like. And at the risk of sounding too optimistic, a crisis is an opportunity to kind of reimagine what you want the new future of your organization or your own practice to look like. So I like the zero-based budgeting technique, where you essentially start with a blank sheet of paper and say, okay, what do we want? I would start with programming or creative output and thinking about what you want your programming to look like over the next year or so, and then let that drive the expenses that you might need to have. And then you could even explore eliminating anything else that wasn't supporting that, which again, could be a pretty major reimagining of your organization or your practice, but it's maybe an interesting time to be having some of those conversations. And then, of course, we know this does not happen just once. This is something that we're going to be updating on a regular basis as the facts and circumstance change, right? Pay attention to what's going on around you, listen to those you serve, and then keep focused on the real value you are providing. If it is helpful to have a couple of key metrics to pay attention to, that's not a bad thing either. Don't pay attention to every number, right? But see if you can identify a couple of the key drivers of success that might make sense for you. And if you need an approved budget to apply for a grant or to provide to a funder, I would still encourage you to follow this scenario planning approach. but maybe choose the most likely scenario, and your board can weigh in on what that might be and use that to approve the full budget, and then use that, update it if needed, and then resubmit it to your funders if things change during the year. But that's an okay scenario. And your board might be uncomfortable approving a budget with a deficit. That is probably something we're going to be seeing over the next year or two. So make sure you're including a plan for handling the deficit, whether you are drawing upon reserves or whether you are using a line of credit, and thinking about how you're going to continue to ensure the fiscal health of the organization over the future years, and provide that narrative to the funder as well if that's necessary. So that's our scenario planning approach. You start with kind of where you are now. You think about where you might be in maybe 4 different scenarios, ranging from very optimistic to not very optimistic at all. Then you include some potential new ideas after you've added in some of the numbers to figure out what your real bottom line might look like. And then you keep updating, you keep paying attention. An organization shared with me that although they were feeling very uncertain, they were also sort of comforted that they didn't have to know what was going to happen, because the virus and the trajectory of this pandemic will let them know which scenario ends up being the most likely. So their job is just to pay attention and respond. And I think in some ways that's comforting. In other ways, that's absolutely terrifying. But if you think about everything you can do and everything you can control, it involves focusing on the real value you provide and continuing to provide that to those you serve. Our recap of the scenario planning steps is here. You, of course, want to start by defining the guiding principles, laying out those different scenarios, projecting out your numbers, playing with them, see what they might look like under those different scenarios, exploring new revenue options, and evaluating the ones that really do make sense for you, because there is no shortage of bad ideas, but you are the one that knows your practice or your organization best. So evaluate the ones that really do make sense for you, and then add them to the scenarios. Then you might have to make some hard choices about what to continue and what to eliminate, and then continue to update them as more information becomes available. And then continue this process once things return to whatever you decide the new normal might be. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up and toss things back to Katie. Katie, do we have additional questions you'd like to address?
Yeah, thanks so much, Elaine. That was a lot of really great information. And I just wanted to let folks know we will have a copy of the slide deck to share with you as well on our website, because I know there are a lot of really great takeaways from this presentation that I'm sure people will want to look at again. So thank you so much for that. We do have a couple of questions, and I just wanted to remind everyone that if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A box if you're with us in Zoom, or comment on the Facebook live stream post if you're listening on Facebook. So we have 2 questions for you, Elaine. Both of them kind of go back to the sponsorship, partnership kind of topic. The first one, this is a really great one. In seeking sponsors, is there a good source to determine which aspects of the market are doing fine during the pandemic? You know, you mentioned a few, but is there like a good hard data source that someone could look to on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to say there are quite a few. One that I have been really liking lately is from an accounting firm called PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. They have been doing a weekly survey of CFOs by industry since the middle of March, I think. Maybe March 23rd was the first one. So they have a whole lot of weekly data, and they break it down by industry and sort of who's doing okay and what people are thinking about and what adjustments our business partners are making. So I think it's called the Controller Survey or the CFO Pulse or something like that. I'll send the link to Katie so she can blast it out to anyone who's registered. But that's through PricewaterhouseCoopers, and that has been one of my go-to sources for insights. Also, a lot of the economic information from April was released sort of in the past 10 days or so. That's also also pretty good data that does come out from the government. So we usually look for that information about a week or so after the end of a month. So if you love the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or some of the CNBC, some of those other sort of financial press outlets, that'll be a good place to go to for some of that summary information. But then you can also, maybe you're targeting a particular industry. Each industry has some sort of association group, right? So, now would not be the time to be targeting retailers, but maybe if, you're really curious what's going on in the retail industry, you find the retail association and sort of dive into some of their data. So, a couple different ways to approach it, but those are some sources I like.
Great, those are really helpful resources. And yeah, if you could send those over, we'll make sure that everybody gets that information as well. And then kind of along those lines, what is the best way to approach partners when we restart programming to share the risks of restarting that programming?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I think, we can think about it in a couple of different ways because there are different types of risks, right? One risk could be a risk that you put on something and you don't sell enough tickets or people aren't really comfortable going, right? So there's a revenue risk. But there also could be a human or a health risk, right? Let's say you host an event and someone comes and contracts the disease or is ill or something, where there could be some liability risk there as well. I am not an attorney, and you probably know as well as I do that a lot of groups are talking about what that liability kind of looks like. So I think understanding what risk we're talking about can help inform some of those conversations with potential partners. If it's a revenue risk, the potential partners can be partners in helping identify additional sources of revenue. I think it's also interesting to think about, as you're thinking about programming, what kind of options can translate easily to a couple of different scenarios versus committing to something that might have a large price tag on it right now and might really need to be performed in person. So I think it's about having those conversations and making strategic choices that preserve the value of the art while also acknowledging the reality of our situation.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors to consider right now, and I think you did a great job of helping us take a look at all of those things. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. It looks like we're coming up right on our hour. That was a very fast hour. It was a great presentation, and I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to do this, and thank you to everyone who tuned in on Zoom and on Facebook Live today. We are so glad to have you. Remember to mark your calendars for these 3 upcoming webinars that you see on your screen. We have Kathy and Katie up next week on Wednesday, May 27th at 4 p.m. talking about the things that you need to know before you apply to our Individual Excellence Award grant program. So don't want to miss that. You can find more information about all of our upcoming webinars at the web address that you see on the screen there. Again, the presentation today was recorded, and so we will have the recording available on our website and on our YouTube channel by the end of the week, so you can find it there. And I think that does it for today's presentation. Thank you again to everyone, and we hope to see you next week. Stay safe and healthy. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye-bye.